The rain began before sunset and never stopped. By midnight, every window of St. Catherine Medical Center trembled beneath sheets of cold water. Ambulances arrived one after another, their flashing lights staining the wet pavement in red and blue. Inside the emergency department, controlled chaos ruled every hallway. Doctors moved quickly. Nurses spoke in calm, practiced voices. Monitors beeped without mercy. Life and death shared the same narrow corridor. Then the hospital's automatic doors burst open. Alessandro De Luca stepped inside. The room changed before he spoke a single word. At over 6 feet tall, dressed in a perfectly tailored black overcoat darkened by rain, he carried the kind of presence that made strangers instinctively move aside. A faded tattoo disappeared beneath the open collar of his white shirt, just visible enough to hint at a past he never discussed. His face remained unreadable. His gray eyes revealed nothing. But the speed of his footsteps betrayed him. For the first time in years, the man feared by everyone looked afraid. 2 security men followed behind him, stopping only when Alessandro raised one hand. "Stay here." They obeyed immediately. He walked alone toward the emergency desk. "My sister." Only 2 words. The receptionist looked up, recognized his name, and immediately called for assistance. Minutes earlier, Isabella De Luca had collapsed during a charity dinner after complaining of severe abdominal pain. She had been unconscious when the ambulance arrived. No one knew why. Alessandro had ignored 3 meetings and crossed half the city without caring who noticed. Power could wait, his sister could not. A physician hurried toward him. "Mr. De Luca, we're preparing her for emergency evaluation. Take me to her." "I'm sorry, not yet." Silence settled between them, not hostile, just heavy. Alessandro slowly nodded. He understood hospitals had rules even money could not rewrite, barely. As he turned toward the waiting area, another figure entered the corridor from the opposite direction. She wore pale blue scrubs beneath a white coat. Her hair was tied back in a loose knot. A hospital badge rested against her chest. No jewelry, no makeup beyond exhaustion. She carried a clipboard with both hands, as though it grounded her. Evelyn De Luca, his wife. She had been working the night shift in the trauma department when the emergency alert reached every unit. Neither of them had expected to meet here tonight. For a brief second, their eyes met. Neither smiled. Neither looked surprised. This had become their marriage. Polite, quiet, carefully distant. 7 years together had taught them how to speak without words. He asked with his eyes if Isabella was alive. She answered with a small nod. He looked away first. There had been a time when she would have walked directly toward him. There had been a time when he would have reached for her hand. That time belonged to another life. Now they simply passed each other like 2 people sharing the same address but different worlds. Evelyn continued toward the surgical wing. Alessandro remained standing beside the waiting room windows, watching rain slide endlessly down the glass. The reflection staring back at him looked older than 41. Much older. He had built an empire by controlling every variable, every negotiation, every risk, every betrayal. Yet hospitals reminded him that control was always an illusion. Hours could disappear inside these walls. One phone call could change an entire family forever. He hated that feeling, not because it frightened him, because it humbled him. A nurse approached quietly. "Mr. De Luca," he turned. "They're taking your sister for imaging first. Can I see her?" For just a moment he followed. The hallway seemed unusually long. Machines rolled past. Families whispered prayers. Someone cried behind a closed curtain. When Isabella's bed appeared around the corner, Alessandro stopped walking. His younger sister looked impossibly small beneath white blankets. An oxygen mask covered half her face. Her eyes remained closed. A monitor traced each heartbeat with relentless precision. He stepped beside her. For several seconds, he simply watched her breathe. He remembered teaching her to ride a bicycle, teaching her how to swim, promising their late mother he would always protect her. Promises made by young men always sounded easier than promises kept by older ones. He gently touched Isabella's hand. "I'll fix this." Whether he spoke to her or to himself, even he wasn't certain. Outside the room, footsteps echoed. Evelyn stood several yards away, speaking softly with another physician. She never interrupted, never demanded attention. That was one of the things Alessandro admired most about her, and perhaps one of the reasons he had taken her quiet strength for granted. When they married, everyone assumed she had won the lottery. A billionaire husband, luxury homes, private jets, a famous family. Few understood that loneliness could exist inside a palace just as easily as inside an empty apartment. Alessandro had never raised his voice at her. never humiliated her, never betrayed their vows with another woman. He simply built invisible walls she could never cross. He believed distance protected people. His mother had died shielding him from violence when he was a boy. Love in his mind always demanded a terrible price, so he offered Evelyn everything except the one thing she needed most, himself. She accepted his silence with remarkable grace. At least, that was what he believed. Across the corridor, Evelyn finished reviewing Isabella's chart. Another doctor hurried toward her. The chief surgeon just arrived. She nodded. I'll brief him. She turned the corner. Alessandro barely noticed. His attention remained fixed on Isabella. Minutes later, everything changed. The chief surgeon entered the consultation hallway, carrying several files beneath one arm. His silver hair framed a face marked by decades of impossible decisions. He walked quickly until he saw Evelyn. Then he stopped completely. His expression shifted from professional focus to unmistakable shock. Evelyn, she froze. The clipboard nearly slipped from her hands. For the first time that night, color disappeared from her face. You! The surgeon took another step closer. I didn't know you were here, she lowered her voice. I work here now. I know that. He looked around carefully before speaking again. I meant, after all these years. Evelyn's eyes flickered toward Alessandro standing farther down the hallway. He doesn't know. The surgeon followed her gaze, his face tightened. He still doesn't. She slowly shook her head. No. A long silence settled between them. Finally, the surgeon spoke, almost in a whisper. I thought you would have told him. I made a promise. Promises sometimes hurt the wrong people. They also save them. The surgeon sighed deeply. There may not be much time left to keep this hidden. Evelyn looked down. I know. Before another word could be exchanged, a resident physician called for the surgeon. He nodded once toward Evelyn and disappeared into the operating area. She remained alone in the corridor. For several seconds she closed her eyes, not to cry, simply to gather enough strength to continue breathing. Then she turned. As she hurried away, something slipped from the pocket of her white coat. It landed softly on the polished floor. A small silver bracelet, old, worn smooth with age, she never noticed. Neither did anyone else. At least, not immediately. Several minutes later, Alessandro left Isabella's room and walked through the same hallway. Something glimmered beneath the overhead lights. He bent down, picked it up. The moment the bracelet touched his palm, his heartbeat faltered. It looked almost identical to another bracelet locked inside the drawer of his bedroom at home. One he had kept for nearly 20 years, one he could never bring himself to throw away, even though he no longer remembered whose wrist had worn it first. He stared toward the empty corridor where Evelyn had disappeared. Behind him, the operating room doors slowly opened. The chief surgeon stepped out. His eyes fell instantly upon the bracelet in Alessandro's hand. For a single terrifying moment, neither man spoke. The bracelet remained in Alessandro's hand long after the chief surgeon walked away. It was cold against his palm, light, ordinary. Yet something about it refused to let him breathe normally. He turned it over once, twice. A tiny scratch crossed one side of the silver band. It looked familiar, painfully familiar, but memory was a strange thing. Sometimes it protected people, sometimes it punished them. Before he could think any further, a nurse approached. Mr. De Luca. He looked up. The surgeons are preparing Miss De Luca now. It'll be several hours. He slipped the bracelet into his coat pocket. I'll wait. The nurse nodded before disappearing down the corridor. Hospitals measured time differently. Minutes stretched into hours. Silence became louder than conversation. Outside, the storm continued to rage. Inside, Alessandro sat alone beside the window, watching rain blur the city lights into fading streaks. He realized he hadn't slept in nearly 30 hours. But exhaustion wasn't what weighed on him. It was the look on Evelyn's face. She had seemed frightened, not because Isabella was in surgery, because of the old surgeon, because of whatever they both knew. 7 years earlier, the wedding had been surprisingly quiet. No magazine photographers, no extravagant ballroom, only close family, a private chapel, simple white flowers. Alessandro had insisted on keeping the ceremony away from public attention. The fewer people watching, he had said, the safer everyone will be. Evelyn had simply smiled. I don't need an audience. She never demanded more than he was willing to give. Perhaps that was why he found her so easy to marry. Their relationship had begun through family connections after Isabella introduced them at a charity fundraiser. Evelyn had been volunteering medical services for underprivileged children. She spoke gently, listened more than she talked, and somehow managed to make every frightened child smile before an examination. She never seemed interested in wealth, never asked about Alessandro's businesses, never treated him like a celebrity. That alone had made her different. After only a few months, marriage seemed practical, reasonable, safe. Love wasn't something Alessandro believed could last forever. Respect could. Commitment could. Responsibility certainly could. So he offered her those instead. On the night of their wedding, they stood together on the balcony overlooking the quiet gardens. The guests had already gone home. The music had stopped. Only distant crickets filled the warm summer air. Alessandro handed her a small velvet box. Inside rested a delicate diamond necklace. "I hope you like it." She admired it for several seconds. "It's beautiful. You deserve beautiful things." She closed the box carefully. Then she looked at him. "What I deserve," she hesitated, "is honesty." He frowned slightly. "I don't understand. If one day you're hurting," her voice was almost a whisper. "Don't hide behind silence," he answered without thinking. "Silence keeps people alive." She didn't argue. She only lowered her eyes. It was the first invisible wall. Neither of them recognized it at the time. Years passed quietly. Alessandro fulfilled every responsibility expected of a husband. Birthdays never passed without gifts. Anniversaries were remembered. Their home remained warm, elegant, and secure. If Evelyn admired a painting, it appeared in the house days later. If she mentioned enjoying a particular author, every book was delivered before the week ended. If she worked overtime, dinner waited for her whenever she came home. From the outside, they looked perfect. Inside, something essential never arrived. Conversations rarely lasted more than a few minutes. Affection became routine. Touch became accidental. Some evenings they sat in the same room for hours without exchanging more than a handful of words. Neither fought, neither complained. Distance became habit. One autumn evening, Isabella visited for dinner. She laughed more than either of them. She filled every silence with stories from work, travel plans, and family gossip. After dessert, she smiled mischievously. "So," she looked at Evelyn, "when are you finally going to give my stubborn brother a baby?" The room fell silent. Evelyn's smile remained graceful. "When the time is right." Isabella laughed. "I've been saying that for 3 years. Alessandro calmly set down his coffee cup. "We're not discussing this." His tone wasn't angry, only final. The conversation moved on. But later that night, Evelyn stood alone on the upstairs balcony, staring into the darkness. She wrapped her arms around herself against the cold, not because of Isabella's question, because she had once imagined answering it differently. Footsteps approached behind her. She turned hopefully. It was Alessandro. For one brief moment she thought he had come to comfort her. Instead, he draped his jacket across her shoulders. "You'll catch a cold." "Thank you." He nodded once. "I'm leaving early tomorrow." "Business?" "Yes. I'll make breakfast. You don't have to wake up." She smiled softly. "I know." He hesitated, almost as if he wanted to say something else. Then he simply walked away. Evelyn watched him disappear through the glass doors. The jacket remained around her shoulders. Warm, heavy, comforting. It felt strangely similar to their marriage. He always protected her. He simply never stayed. Only one person noticed the quiet sadness growing between them. Old Thomas, the De Luca family's elderly butler. He had served Alessandro's parents before Alessandro was born. He had watched generations fall in love and watched pride destroy many of them. One afternoon he found Evelyn arranging fresh lilies in the dining room. "Mrs. De Luca." She looked up. "Yes, Thomas." "You've changed," she smiled politely. "I've grown older." "No." He shook his head gently. "You've grown lonelier." She looked back at the flowers. For several moments she said nothing. Finally she answered, "I knew the kind of man I married, and are you happy?" Her fingers paused on a white lily. "I love him." Thomas waited. She continued quietly, "But loving someone and being seen by them," she swallowed, "are not always the same thing." The old butler lowered his eyes. He had no comforting answer because she was right. Back in the present, the operating room light still glowed red. Alessandro remained awake, replaying memories that suddenly felt incomplete. The bracelet, the surgeon. Evelyn's frightened expression, none of it fit together. His phone vibrated. It was a message from home. Old Thomas. "Sir, I believe there is something in the library that Mrs. De Luca hoped you would never need to find. No explanation, no details, just that single sentence." Alessandro stared at the screen, then slowly looked toward the operating room doors. For the first time in years, he had the unsettling feeling that the woman sleeping beside him every night had been carrying an entire life he had never truly seen. And somewhere inside the De Luca mansion, something had been waiting 7 years to be discovered. Morning arrived without sunshine. The rain had stopped just before dawn, leaving the city wrapped in a pale gray silence that made everything outside the hospital seem distant and unreal. Inside the intensive care unit, Isabella remained unconscious but stable. The surgery had gone well. The doctors were cautiously optimistic. For everyone else, the crisis appeared to be ending. For Alessandro, it felt as though something much larger had only just begun. He stood outside his sister's room with a paper cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. He never drank it. His thoughts kept returning to Evelyn. She had vanished before sunrise. A nurse explained that her shift had ended hours earlier. She had gone home, or at least that was what everyone assumed. The chief surgeon passed through the hallway carrying a stack of reports. When he noticed Alessandro waiting alone, he offered a polite nod. "I expect your sister to recover." "Thank you." The surgeon hesitated. His eyes drifted for the briefest moment toward Alessandro's coat pocket, toward the bracelet. "You should get some rest." "I will." Neither man believed the answer. The surgeon walked away without another word. Alessandro watched him disappear, certain that the older man was carrying answers he refused to give. Across the city, Evelyn unlocked the front door of the De Luca mansion. The house was unusually quiet. She removed her shoes near the entrance, setting them neatly beside the staircase before walking slowly toward the kitchen. Old Thomas was already there. A kettle whistled softly on the stove. Without asking, he poured her a cup of tea. "You've had a long night." "So have you." He gave a faint smile. "I've been waiting." She wrapped both hands around the warm cup. Neither spoke for several moments. Finally, Thomas broke the silence. "Did he find the bracelet?" Evelyn closed her eyes. "I think he did. You always believed that day would come." "I hoped it wouldn't." Thomas looked at her carefully. "You still intend to leave?" she answered without hesitation. "Yes." There was sadness in her voice, but not uncertainty. "I stayed because I loved him." She looked toward the large dining room where countless family dinners had been held over the years. "I can't stay because I'm invisible." Thomas lowered his head. He had watched her spend 7 years, protecting a family that never fully understood what she had already sacrificed for them. He had also watched Alessandro mistake silence for peace. The tragedy was that neither of them had ever stopped loving the other. They had simply learned different languages of love. By late morning, another storm was beginning, not outside. Inside St. Catherine Medical Center, the hospital's Board of Ethics had launched a routine digital audit. After discovering inconsistencies in several archived transplant records from years earlier, no one considered it unusual. Large hospitals performed audits all the time, but this one reached much deeper than expected. Boxes that had remained untouched for years were ordered into review. Electronic backups were compared against handwritten files. Old consent forms were requested from long-term storage. In the records department, employees exchanged puzzled looks. Why are they reopening files from 7 years ago? No idea. Apparently there are missing documents. Someone shrugged. It'll probably be nothing. But sometimes, history waited patiently for exactly the right moment to return. Several miles away, Vivian Moretti received a phone call while attending a fundraising luncheon. She excused herself from the table before answering. "Yes." The voice on the other end spoke quickly. Vivian's expression changed almost instantly. "What do you mean they're auditing everything?" She listened. "No." Her tone became sharp. "Those files were supposed to remain sealed." Another pause, then, "Find out exactly what they have." She ended the call. For several seconds she stood perfectly still. Around her, guests laughed over expensive wine and elegant desserts. No one noticed the tension behind her composed smile. 7 years earlier, she had believed every loose end had been eliminated. The hospital administrator had accepted the money. The recognition ceremony had gone exactly as planned. The newspapers praised Vivian for helping save Isabella De Luca's life. The real donor had disappeared without claiming anything. Everything had been perfect, until now she picked up her phone again. One message: "Meet me immediately." "Burn anything connected to the transplant." She pressed send. That afternoon, Alessandro finally returned home. The mansion felt strangely unfamiliar. He walked through rooms that had always seemed permanent. Now each one carried traces of Evelyn. Fresh flowers arranged in crystal vases, books carefully organized by color, a blanket folded over the living room sofa, a handwritten grocery list resting beside a bowl of fruit, small acts of care so ordinary that he had stopped seeing them years ago. Thomas greeted him quietly. "Welcome home, sir. How is she?" The old butler understood immediately. "Mrs. De Luca is resting." Alessandro nodded. He started toward the staircase before Thomas spoke again. "There is something you should see." He led Alessandro into the family library. Sunlight filtered through tall windows, illuminating shelves filled with leather-bound books collected across generations. Thomas walked toward an old writing desk. He opened a drawer. Inside rested a sealed ivory envelope. No name, no date, only a single sentence written in Evelyn's handwriting, for Alessandro. "Only if the truth can no longer remain hidden." Alessandro frowned. "What is this? I promised Mrs. De Luca I would keep it safe. And now?" Thomas met his eyes. "I believe that promise has reached its end." Alessandro reached for the envelope. His fingers stopped just above it. For reasons he couldn't explain, he wasn't ready. Not yet. He closed the drawer instead. "If she wanted me to read it," his voice trailed off. Thomas answered gently. "Sometimes people write letters because they believe they will never be heard face to face." The words lingered long after the old butler left the room. At the hospital, the audit continued. A young archivist unlocked an aging storage room beneath the oldest wing of the building. Dust floated through narrow beams of afternoon light. Metal shelves stretched from floor to ceiling. Most of the labels had faded long ago. She searched through dozens of transplant records before stopping in front of one damaged archive box. Its inventory tag had partially burned away. She carefully lifted the lid. Inside were handwritten surgical notes, old donor consent forms, recovery charts, and beneath them, a sealed evidence envelope that had somehow escaped every previous inspection. She stared at it for several seconds. The hospital seal remained unbroken. She picked up the phone. "I think I found something." Elsewhere in the same building, a maintenance worker pushed a cart past the archive corridor. He never noticed another man watching from the shadows. The stranger waited until the archivist stepped away to answer her call. Then he quietly entered the storage room. His gloved hands moved with practiced precision. He found the damaged archive box. His breathing slowed there, exactly where he had been told it would be. He reached inside, but before he could remove the sealed envelope, voices echoed from the hallway. Someone was coming back. The man abandoned the box and slipped through a side exit just seconds before the archivist returned. She looked around, sensing that something felt wrong. One shelf had shifted. The dust had been disturbed. Someone else had been there. She immediately locked the room. Then she carried the archive box herself toward the administrative offices. Unaware that she was holding the first piece of evidence capable of destroying a lie that had survived for 7 years. And somewhere across the city, Vivian's phone rang. She answered before the first ring ended. The voice on the other side spoke only 6 words. "We failed." Vivian's face drained of color. "The archive box still exists." The invitation had been planned months in advance. Every autumn, the De Luca Foundation hosted its largest charity gala. Doctors, judges, business leaders, artists, journalists. Hundreds of guests gathered beneath the crystal chandeliers of the Grand Astoria Ballroom to celebrate another year of medical philanthropy. On the surface, it was an evening about generosity. Behind polished smiles, it was also an evening about reputation. For the De Luca family, appearances had always mattered. Not because they craved admiration, because influence often depended on trust. Alessandro arrived just after sunset. His black tuxedo fit him with effortless precision. Every conversation seemed to pause as he entered the ballroom. People greeted him with respectful nods. He acknowledged them politely. His attention, however, drifted elsewhere. Toward the entrance, he was waiting for Evelyn. They had barely spoken since the night at the hospital. She had returned home before dawn. He had spent the day moving between the mansion and St. Catherine Medical Center, checking on Isabella's recovery while trying unsuccessfully to silence the questions growing louder inside his own mind. The bracelet remained in his pocket. He had almost asked Evelyn about it that morning. Almost. Instead, they had shared breakfast across a table that suddenly felt far too large. She had poured him coffee. He had thanked her. She had asked whether Isabella was improving. He had answered yes. Nothing more. The conversation ended before it truly began. Now, watching guests fill the ballroom, Alessandro wondered how 2 people could spend 7 years together and still know so little about each other. A soft murmur spread through the room. Evelyn had arrived. She wore a midnight blue evening gown that reflected the ballroom lights like calm water beneath a moonlit sky. Her hair rested loosely over one shoulder. She wore no extravagant jewelry, only a pair of simple pearl earrings. Elegant, graceful, quiet, just like the woman herself. Several guests complimented her as she entered. She thanked each of them with genuine warmth. She remembered names. She asked about families. She congratulated a young doctor on the birth of his daughter. She comforted an elderly donor whose wife had recently passed away. None of it was performed for attention. Kindness came naturally to her. Alessandro watched from across the room. He realized something unsettling. Everyone seemed to know his wife, not because she carried the De Luca name, because she made people feel seen. He couldn't remember the last time he had asked how her day had been. The realization lingered longer than he expected. Near the stage, Vivian Moretti accepted congratulations from nearly every guest who approached. She looked flawless beneath the warm lights, confident, composed, untouchable. No one would have guessed that only hours earlier she had been told an archive box still existed. She had barely slept, yet years of carefully practiced elegance concealed every crack. When she noticed Alessandro approaching, her smile widened. "I'm relieved Isabella is recovering. So am I. I've been praying for her." "I know." She lightly touched his arm. "If there's anything I can do," he offered a courteous nod. "Thank you. Nothing more." Vivian sensed the distance immediately. It was subtle, but different. His attention kept wandering, not toward her, toward Evelyn. The first time in years, Vivian felt something she rarely allowed herself to experience: fear. Dinner concluded with the Foundation's annual recognition ceremony. The chairman stepped onto the stage. "Ladies and gentlemen," the conversations faded. "This evening is dedicated to those whose compassion has transformed countless lives." Applause filled the ballroom. Several physicians received awards. Longtime donors were honored. Volunteers accepted standing ovations. Then the chairman smiled. "There is one extraordinary woman whose generosity forever changed the De Luca family." A spotlight swept across the audience, stopping on Vivian. "Ladies and gentlemen," he extended his hand toward her, "Miss Vivian Moretti." The applause became thunderous. Vivian rose gracefully. Every camera turned toward her. She climbed the stage with practiced confidence. The chairman continued. "Years ago, during one of the most difficult moments in the De Luca family's history, Miss Moretti's extraordinary selflessness helped save Miss Isabella De Luca's life." More applause. Some guests wiped away tears. Others stood. Vivian accepted the Crystal Award with perfect humility. It was simply the right thing to do. She lowered her eyes modestly. "I never expected recognition." The words echoed across the ballroom, each one landing like another stone upon Evelyn's heart. She remained seated, hands folded quietly in her lap. No anger crossed her face, no bitterness, only an exhaustion so deep it seemed to reach her soul. She remembered another hospital room, another storm, another impossible decision. She remembered signing forms with trembling hands, the pain after surgery, months of recovery, the promise she had made. No publicity, no reward, no gratitude required, only one wish, that Isabella would live. She had kept that promise. Completely, perhaps too completely. The chairman invited Alessandro onto the stage. "Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Alessandro De Luca." The applause returned. Alessandro accepted the microphone. He looked toward Isabella, who had insisted on attending despite her recent surgery. She smiled proudly from the front row. Then he turned toward Vivian. "Our family has faced many difficult seasons." His voice remained calm. "But there are debts that cannot truly be repaid." He paused. "When my sister needed hope," he looked directly at Vivian, "you gave it to her." Another wave of applause swept through the ballroom. "You reminded us that courage often arrives quietly." Alessandro inclined his head respectfully. "Our family will never forget what you did." For one endless moment, the room stood together, clapping, celebrating, honoring the wrong person. Across the ballroom, Evelyn lowered her gaze. She had imagined this moment many times over the years. Not because she wanted applause, because somewhere deep inside, a small part of her had once hoped Alessandro might someday discover the truth on his own. That hope disappeared beneath the sound of hundreds of hands applauding another woman. She smiled gently. Not for herself, for Isabella. Then she rose from her chair. No one noticed her leave. The ballroom doors closed softly behind her. The hallway outside was silent. The music became distant, almost unreal. She walked without knowing exactly where she intended to go, only that she needed air. She stepped onto the empty terrace overlooking the city. Night had settled completely. The rain had returned. A light drizzle drifted through the cold autumn air. She rested both hands against the stone railing. For several minutes, she simply listened to the rain. Footsteps echoed behind her. The chief surgeon emerged from the doorway. He had attended the gala as one of the foundation's honored guests. When he saw Evelyn standing alone, he stopped beside her. "I was looking for you," she smiled faintly. "I thought you might." He glanced back toward the ballroom. "They're applauding her. Yes, you could end this tonight. I know. Then why don't you?" Evelyn closed her eyes. "Because the truth shouldn't be told to satisfy my pain." The surgeon studied her face. "You've protected everyone except yourself." She gave a quiet laugh. "So it seems." He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. "There are people reviewing the old transplant records. I heard. If they find the original authorization, they'll know." He nodded. "And when they do," she finished the sentence before he could, "everything will change." The surgeon looked at her with unmistakable sadness. "My only fear," he said softly, "is that the truth will arrive after it's already too late." Inside the ballroom, Alessandro finished his speech. The applause faded. Photographers surrounded Vivian. Guests formed small circles of conversation. Instinctively, Alessandro searched the room. He couldn't find Evelyn. He checked the dance floor, the dining tables, the grand staircase. Nothing. A strange uneasiness settled over him. He stepped into the hallway. The terrace doors stood slightly open. Cool rain drifted inside. He walked toward them. By the time he reached the terrace, Evelyn was gone. Only one thing remained. Resting carefully on the rain-damp stone railing, her wedding ring, not abandoned in anger, not thrown away, simply placed there with quiet certainty, as though she had finally laid down a burden she could no longer carry. Alessandro stared at the ring. The world around him became impossibly still. Behind him, hidden in the shadows beyond the open doors, the chief surgeon watched in silence. He closed his eyes for a brief moment, then whispered to himself. He waited 7 years to notice her. A cold wind swept across the empty terrace, and somewhere beneath the old hospital, a sealed evidence envelope was finally being prepared to be opened. The wedding ring remained exactly where Evelyn had left it, a single circle of gold, barely visible beneath the terrace lights. Tiny drops of rain gathered along its polished surface before slipping quietly onto the cold stone. Alessandro stared at it without moving. For reasons he could not explain, picking it up felt more difficult than signing contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars. His hand hovered above it. Then finally, he closed his fingers around the ring. It was still warm. She couldn't have been gone for more than a few minutes. He turned toward the ballroom. Guests were laughing. Music drifted through the open doors. Crystal glasses clinked together in celebration. Inside, the evening continued exactly as planned. Outside, his marriage had quietly begun to fall apart. When Alessandro returned home after midnight, the mansion was dark. Only a single lamp burned in the library. Old Thomas was waiting. He rose from his chair the moment Alessandro entered. "You found it." Alessandro opened his hand. The wedding ring rested in his palm. Thomas looked at it for several long seconds. Then he lowered his eyes. "I was hoping this day would never come. Where is she?" "In her room." Alessandro frowned. "Our room." Thomas did not argue. He simply nodded. "Yes, sir." Alessandro climbed the staircase more slowly than usual. The bedroom door stood slightly open. Inside, Evelyn was folding clothes into a single medium-sized suitcase. Not many, just enough for someone who had already decided what truly mattered. She looked up as he entered. Neither of them appeared surprised. "You came home early. So did you?" A quiet smile touched her lips. "I suppose I did." His eyes moved toward the suitcase. "Are you traveling? For a while? Where? I haven't decided yet." Silence settled between them. He reached into his pocket. Without saying a word, he placed the wedding ring on the dresser. She looked at it, then back at him. "You found it?" "Yes." Another silence. Longer this time. Finally, Alessandro spoke. "You forgot it." She shook her head gently. "No," the answer landed. With surprising force, he searched her face for anger. There was none. Only peace, a heartbreaking kind of peace. "Evelyn," his voice softened. "If this is because of tonight, it isn't only tonight." She carefully folded another sweater before continuing. "Tonight was simply the first time I realized I could no longer pretend I wasn't hurting." He wanted to answer immediately. Instead, he listened, perhaps for the first time in years. "I don't blame you for believing what everyone else believed." She spoke calmly. "I blame myself." He frowned. "For what?" "For believing that love could survive forever without being spoken." The room became impossibly quiet. "I kept waiting." She smiled sadly. "For conversations that never happened. I kept hoping one day you'd ask me what frightened me. Her hands rested on the suitcase. "Or what made me happy." She looked at him with extraordinary gentleness. "You always protected me." A tear formed but never fell. "You simply never let me stand close enough to protect you." Alessandro felt something inside him begin to fracture. He had always believed he had been a good husband, faithful, responsible, reliable. Now he wondered whether those things had ever been enough. "Evelyn, I know." She spared him the effort of explaining. "You never meant to hurt me." She stepped closer. "So please don't apologize for being the man you believed you had to become." She reached into the bedside drawer. Carefully, almost reverently, she removed a cream-colored envelope. The same ivory stationery she had always preferred. She held it toward him. "If someday you truly want to know me." Her fingers trembled ever so slightly. "Read this." He looked down. No name, no date. Only a single pressed white lily tucked beneath the folded flap. Before he could accept it, she quietly pulled her hand back. "Not tonight." She placed it inside her suitcase instead. "When the time comes." She closed the zipper. The sound echoed louder than either of them expected. 3 days later, the divorce petition arrived. It contained no accusations, no demands, no request for financial settlement. Only one sentence explained her decision: irreconcilable emotional separation. Alessandro read the page several times. Each reading somehow made the words heavier. His attorney waited patiently across the desk. "Would you like us to contest it?" "No." "We could delay the proceedings." "No." Perhaps Mrs. De Luca would reconsider after some time. Alessandro looked toward the windows overlooking the city. "If someone asks for freedom," his voice was almost inaudible, "keeping them by force isn't love." The attorney slowly nodded. He placed another folder on the desk. "Then these are the final documents." Alessandro signed them one by one. The pen felt strangely heavy. With every signature, he sensed he was giving away something he had never fully understood while he still possessed it. Across the ocean, an international humanitarian organization prepared emergency medical teams for a remote region recovering from severe flooding. Doctors, nurses, trauma specialists, volunteers. Their departure was scheduled within 2 weeks. Evelyn quietly accepted the assignment. The coordinator smiled warmly. "Most people hesitate," she answered honestly. "I need somewhere that reminds me how to begin again." "We'll be honored to have you." She signed the final acceptance papers. No one there knew her last name. No one recognized the De Luca family. For the first time in many years, she felt almost anonymous. There was unexpected comfort in that feeling. Meanwhile, at St. Catherine Medical Center, Isabella's recovery suddenly changed. What had begun as a promising morning quickly turned into confusion. Her blood pressure dropped without warning. Pain returned with frightening intensity. Doctors rushed into her room. Machines sounded urgent alarms. Within minutes, she was being wheeled back toward intensive care. The chief surgeon met the emergency team outside the operating suite. "Run every scan again." Another physician looked puzzled. "The transplant site, everything, but her previous records." "I want the original records." His voice was firm. "Not the digital copies. The originals." A younger doctor hesitated. "Some of those files are still under archival review." "Then retrieve them immediately." Downstairs, beneath the oldest wing of the hospital, the archivist unlocked the secured evidence cabinet. The damaged archive box rested on the top shelf. Beside it, the sealed envelope. She carried both items upstairs herself. Every signature required for release was completed. Every security seal verified. The chief surgeon accepted the box with unusual care. He placed it on a stainless steel table inside a private consultation room. Several physicians gathered around. One by one, the aging documents emerged. Handwritten operative notes, recovery charts, laboratory reports, pages yellowed with time. Then, near the bottom of the box, the surgeon found something that should never have disappeared. An original donor consent packet, untouched, complete. He stared at the signature visible through the translucent cover sheet. His breathing slowed. One of the younger doctors leaned closer. "Is something wrong?" The surgeon closed the folder before anyone else could read it. No. But his voice betrayed him. Everything was wrong. Everything. He looked toward the intensive care unit where Isabella fought for recovery. Then toward the hospital corridor where Alessandro had spent the previous 3 days refusing to leave his sister's side. The truth had survived. Against every attempt to erase it, it had survived. The surgeon closed his eyes briefly. There was no longer any ethical reason to remain silent. Only one painful question remained. Would revealing the truth now save a family, or destroy what little remained of it? He picked up the phone. Please ask Mr. Alessandro De Luca to come. The nurse on the other end answered immediately. Should anyone else be present? The surgeon looked once more at the name on the hidden consent form. His expression grew solemn. No. A long pause followed. I need to speak with him. Alone. The consultation room felt colder than the rest of the hospital. Not because of the air conditioning. Because truth had a way of changing the temperature of a room long before anyone spoke. Alessandro stood outside the closed door. For several seconds after the nurse guided him there, he had spent nearly 4 days sleeping in waiting rooms, answering endless calls from attorneys, doctors, and family friends. He looked exhausted. His beard had begun to grow in unevenly. The sharp confidence people associated with Alessandro De Luca had softened beneath worry. The nurse opened the door. The chief surgeon is waiting. Alessandro stepped inside. The room was simple. A wooden table, 4 chairs, a wall clock that ticked with unbearable precision. The chief surgeon stood beside a stack of aging medical files. He looked as though he hadn't slept either. Please. He motioned toward the chair. Alessandro remained standing. How is my sister? Stable. The answer brought only a brief moment of relief. But that isn't why I asked you here. Alessandro's expression hardened. What is it? The surgeon rested one hand on the old archive box. You asked me several days ago whether I was hiding something. A long silence followed. I was. Alessandro said nothing. There are facts I should have spoken about years ago. Then why didn't you? Because I gave my word. To whom? The surgeon looked down at the worn medical records. To someone who believed protecting your family mattered more than receiving gratitude. Alessandro's heartbeat slowed. He immediately thought of Evelyn. He didn't know why. He simply did. The surgeon carefully removed a yellowed surgical notebook. This was written during Isabella's transplant. The pages had faded with time. Corners were worn. Several notes had been written by hand in dark blue ink. The digital records were altered years later. Alessandro frowned. Altered. We recently discovered inconsistencies. By whom? We're still investigating. The surgeon slid the notebook across the table. I want you to read one paragraph. Alessandro lowered his eyes. The handwriting was difficult to read, but one sentence stood out. Anonymous donor requested complete confidentiality before surgery. Nothing more, no name, no signature, only that single note. Anonymous? The surgeon nodded. The donor refused recognition. Alessandro looked confused. I was told Vivian Moretti. You were told many things. The surgeon interrupted himself before saying more. His jaw tightened. There are still documents I must verify before I can explain everything. The room fell silent again. Questions multiplied faster than answers. Across the city, Evelyn packed the final box from her office. Her locker inside the trauma department was nearly empty. A framed photograph of several nurses during a volunteer mission. A worn notebook, a small first aid kit she had carried since nursing school. Nothing expensive, nothing sentimental enough to prevent her from leaving. One of her colleagues entered quietly. I heard you're resigning. Evelyn smiled gently. Yes, I thought you loved working here. I do. Then why leave? She looked around the emergency department. Doctors hurried between rooms. Stretchers rolled past. Families waited with quiet hope. I've learned something, her colleague waited. Sometimes the place you love, she folded her uniform carefully, also becomes the place where your heart can no longer heal. The younger nurse hugged her unexpectedly. We're going to miss you. You'll miss you too. She meant it. Meanwhile, the internal investigation accelerated. Hospital administrators compared archived paperwork against the electronic database. Every discrepancy pointed toward 1 year. 7 years earlier, the transplant. The audit committee requested payroll records, security logs, storage access reports. Nothing matched perfectly. Someone had erased names, moved files, deleted timestamps. It had been done carefully, professionally, but not perfectly. History always left fingerprints. Vivian sat alone inside her penthouse apartment, overlooking the river. She had dismissed her assistants hours ago. For the first time in years, she felt isolated. The phone on the table remained silent. That frightened her more than constant ringing. Finally, it vibrated. She answered immediately. Tell me. The man on the other end sounded nervous. They found the original consent packet. Vivian closed her eyes. And it hasn't been made public. Yet no. She walked slowly toward the window. Can it still disappear? A painful pause. I don't think so. Vivian leaned her forehead against the cool glass. Years earlier, she had believed one decision could secure the future she wanted. Recognition, influence, a place beside Alessandro. Instead, Every lie she had protected was beginning to collapse under its own weight. She whispered to herself, I never wanted to hurt Isabella. She truly believed it. She hadn't wanted anyone to suffer. She had only wanted to become indispensable. Sometimes, the worst mistakes began with desires that sounded almost reasonable. Back at the mansion, old Thomas entered the library carrying a tray of tea. He stopped when he noticed Alessandro standing before the fireplace. The silver bracelet rested in his hand once again. You've been looking at that for hours. Alessandro didn't turn around. I know I've seen it before. Thomas remained silent. I just can't remember where. The old butler smiled sadly. Memory is peculiar. It returns when the heart is finally willing to see what the eyes ignored. Alessandro looked toward him. What does that mean? Instead of answering directly, Thomas walked toward a small cabinet beneath the bookshelf. From the lowest drawer he removed an old wooden box. Dust covered its surface. I've kept this for many years. He placed it carefully on the table. It belonged to your mother. Alessandro slowly opened the lid. Inside were photographs, holiday cards, childhood drawings, small keepsakes from another lifetime. Near the bottom, he found a faded photograph. A teenage Isabella smiled brightly beside a hospital bed. Standing behind her, a young volunteer nurse whose face was partially turned away from the camera. She wore her hair differently. She looked younger, but something about her posture, her smile, felt strangely familiar. Tucked behind the photograph rested another object, a second silver bracelet identical, except for one tiny engraving inside the band. Hope. Alessandro's breathing caught. His fingers traced the word slowly. A distant memory stirred, not complete, only fragments. Rain. A frightened teenage girl crying in a hospital corridor. A young nurse kneeling beside her, removing one bracelet from her own wrist, fastening it gently around Isabella's hand. A quiet promise, you'll never be alone. The memory disappeared as quickly as it had come, leaving only questions behind. Who was she? Thomas lowered his eyes. I think, he answered softly. You already know. That evening? The chief surgeon remained alone in his office long after everyone else had gone home. The donor consent packet rested on his desk. Beside it lay one final sealed envelope. Unlike the medical records, this envelope had never been opened, not even once. Its edges had yellowed with age. Across the front, written in careful handwriting, were only 6 words. To be opened only if necessary. No sender, no recipient. Just those words. The surgeon knew exactly where it had come from. He had promised never to break the seal unless circumstances demanded it. For 7 years, they hadn't. Now they did. He took a slow breath, then reached for the letter opener. The blade slipped beneath the brittle paper. The seal broke with the faintest sound. Inside rested a folded letter, and beneath it, one final document that would change everything Alessandro De Luca believed about his marriage. The surgeon unfolded the first page. His eyes widened. He whispered only 3 words. Oh, Evelyn. Outside his office, footsteps approached. Alessandro had arrived. The truth was no longer waiting in the shadows. It was waiting behind a single unopened door. Alessandro stopped outside the surgeon's office. The door was slightly open. Warm light spilled into the quiet hallway, cutting through the darkness that had settled over the hospital. For several seconds he simply stood there. His hand rested on the doorknob. His heartbeat felt strangely loud. Not because he feared bad news about Isabella. He had lived with fear before. This felt different. This felt like standing at the edge of a life he no longer recognized. The chief surgeon looked up as Alessandro entered. He appeared older than he had only an hour earlier. The open envelope remained on his desk. Beside it rested the original donor consent packet, several photographs, a handwritten surgical report, and one folded letter. The surgeon motioned toward the chair. This won't be easy. Alessandro remained standing. Tell me. The surgeon nodded slowly. For 7 years, I've honored a promise. He looked down at the documents. I believed I was protecting someone. A painful silence followed. I now realize that keeping silent has hurt everyone involved. Alessandro's voice was calm. Start at the beginning. The surgeon opened the donor file. 7 years ago, Isabella's condition became critical. You know that part. Alessandro nodded. She needed an emergency liver transplant. We had almost no time. The surgeon paused. There was one compatible donor. Alessandro waited. The donor refused publicity. I know. The surgeon met his eyes. No, he spoke quietly. You know what you were told. He carefully turned the first page. The original consent form lay beneath a transparent protective sleeve. At the bottom, one signature, clear, undeniable. Evelyn Carter. The room became perfectly still. Alessandro didn't blink. Didn't breathe, he simply stared. No, the word escaped before he could stop it. The surgeon gently slid another document across the desk. This is the original authorization. Another signature, the same handwriting, the same name. The date matched Isabella's surgery exactly. Vivian never donated. The surgeon's voice remained steady. She wasn't even medically compatible. Alessandro slowly looked up. What are you saying? I'm saying, the surgeon swallowed. Your wife saved your sister's life. Silence. The clock on the wall continued ticking. Somewhere outside, a cart rolled through the corridor. Life continued. Inside the office, everything had stopped. Alessandro lowered himself into the chair without realizing he had done so. His hands rested on his knees, empty, motionless. I don't understand. The surgeon reached for another folder. Neither did he. He opened it carefully, not at first. Inside were recovery notes written during Evelyn's hospitalization, her blood tests, her surgical evaluations, pages documenting weeks of painful recovery. She remained in this hospital for nearly 3 weeks, the surgeon's voice softened. Most of that time, he looked directly at Alessandro. She kept asking only one question. Alessandro whispered, "What question? Is Isabella going to live?" The words landed harder than any accusation, the surgeon continued. She never asked whether anyone would thank her, never asked whether her name would appear in the papers, never asked whether you would know. He picked up the folded letter from the opened envelope, because she specifically requested that you never be told. Alessandro looked up sharply. Why? The surgeon handed him the letter. You should read her own words. His hands trembled as he unfolded the yellowed paper. The handwriting was unmistakably Evelyn's. Simple, careful, gentle. If Isabella survives, please don't tell Mr. De Luca what I've done. He already carries enough guilt. If he believes he owes me his gratitude, he'll feel responsible for loving me. I never want love to become a debt. If one day he chooses me, I want it to be because he truly sees me, not because he feels obligated. Please promise me that, Evelyn. The letter slipped slightly in Alessandro's hands. He read it again, then again. Each sentence shattered another piece of the life he believed he understood. I kept my promise. The surgeon's eyes filled with quiet regret. I truly believed it was the right thing. I thought she was protecting both of you. He looked toward the window. I never imagined 7 years would pass. Alessandro closed his eyes. Memories returned with unbearable clarity. Evelyn waiting beside the dining table. Evelyn smiling when he came home late. Evelyn sitting beside Isabella through countless medical appointments. Evelyn quietly leaving every room whenever praise for Vivian began. He had seen every moment, yet he had understood none of them. I thanked the wrong woman. His voice cracked. The surgeon said nothing. I stood on that stage, Alessandro whispered, while my wife listened. He covered his face with both hands. For the first time since he was a child, he cried. Not loudly, not dramatically, just quietly. Like a man finally mourning everything he had failed to notice. Several minutes passed before either of them spoke again. Finally, Alessandro lifted his head. Vivian. The surgeon nodded. The investigation uncovered evidence that hospital records were altered. He opened another folder. Bank transfers, administrative approvals, internal emails recovered from archived servers. One former records administrator had already confessed to accepting money. Recognition documents had been rewritten. The anonymous donor designation had disappeared. Vivian's name had replaced it. It wasn't one mistake, the surgeon said softly. It was years of deception. Alessandro stared at the evidence. Surprisingly, he felt no rage, only sorrow. Sorrow for Isabella, sorrow for Evelyn, sorrow for the years that could never be returned. His phone suddenly vibrated. It was old Thomas, he answered immediately. Thomas, the old butler's usually steady voice sounded shaken. Sir, what happened? I've just returned from Mrs. De Luca's room. Alessandro stood. What is it? She's gone. His heart stopped. What do you mean gone? She left before sunrise. Thomas paused. Her passport is missing. The suitcase is gone. And another painful silence. There was a letter on the bed. Alessandro closed his eyes, read it. Thomas unfolded the page. His voice trembled. By the time you read this, I'll already be on my way to join the humanitarian medical mission. Please don't look for me because you feel guilty. Guilt fades, love doesn't. If you ever come, come because you've learned the difference. The call ended in silence. Alessandro lowered the phone. The surgeon quietly stepped closer. The airport. Alessandro looked up. She told me yesterday her team was scheduled to leave today. He checked the wall clock. The second hand swept relentlessly forward. They're due to depart in less than an hour for one heartbeat. Alessandro remained frozen. Then he grabbed the donor letter, the silver bracelet, Evelyn's handwritten note. He held them against his chest as though they were the only things keeping him standing. Without another word, he ran through the corridor, past the intensive care unit, past the waiting families, past the life he had always believed was secure. Behind him, the chief surgeon watched the empty hallway. He whispered a silent prayer. Not that Alessandro would reach the airport, but that if he did, he wouldn't arrive 7 years and 1 hour too late. The drive to the airport should have taken 40 minutes. Alessandro covered the distance in less than 30. For the first time in years, he ignored every phone call, every meeting, every obligation. The city blurred beyond the windshield. As dawn painted the horizon in pale gold, his mind replayed only one voice. If you ever come, come because you've learned the difference. He gripped the steering wheel tighter. He finally understood what Evelyn had meant. Love could never be repaid like a debt. It could only be given freely. By the time he reached the international terminal, passengers were already moving through security. Families embraced. Children laughed. Announcements echoed through the departure hall. Alessandro searched every face, every line, every gate. His heart raced with every woman wearing blue medical scrubs. None of them were Evelyn. He reached the airline counter. A humanitarian medical team departed this morning. The employee typed quickly. I'm sorry, sir, I can't release passenger information. I don't need information. His voice remained calm despite the desperation beneath it. I only need to know one thing. He paused. Did they leave? The employee looked at the departure screen, then back at him. The flight departed 12 minutes ago. 12 minutes, not 7 years, just 12 minutes. Yet it felt just as impossible to cross. Alessandro looked through the massive glass windows toward the runway. A single aircraft climbed steadily into the morning sky. He watched until it disappeared into the clouds. He did not run. He did not shout. He simply stood there. For the first time in his life, he accepted that some moments could not be forced. Some mistakes could not be corrected by arriving breathless. At the last second, he slipped the silver bracelet into his pocket. Then quietly turned around. There was still something he had to do. When Alessandro returned to St. Catherine Medical Center, Isabella was awake. She looked tired but alert. A smile crossed her face as he entered. You look terrible, he almost laughed. I probably do. She noticed his expression immediately. What happened? He pulled a chair beside her bed. For several seconds he couldn't speak. Finally he took her hand. Everything you believed about your transplant, he swallowed, was a lie, she frowned. What do you mean? He placed the original donor authorization on the blanket between them. You need to read this. Isabella slowly unfolded the document. Her eyes moved across the page, then stopped. She looked again, longer this time. No, she whispered the word almost exactly as Alessandro had. This can't be right. It is. She looked up. Evelyn, he nodded. She was your donor. The room fell silent. Tears gathered instantly in Isabella's eyes. All these years, she covered her mouth. I thanked Vivian. I know. I gave speeches. I know. I celebrated the wrong person. Her shoulders trembled. And Evelyn never said anything. No. Why? Alessandro handed her the letter Evelyn had written before surgery. Isabella read every line through tears. By the end, she was crying openly. She didn't want you to love her because you felt obligated, Alessandro spoke softly. She wanted to be chosen. Isabella pressed the letter against her heart. I never truly knew her. You did. He looked toward the window. You just never knew how much she loved us. News of the investigation spread quickly. The hospital's ethics committee completed its review within days. The evidence was overwhelming. Original records, financial transfers, altered recognition documents, archived security logs. One former records administrator admitted accepting money to replace donor identification. The deception had not been an accident. It had been carefully planned. Authorities opened a formal investigation. The foundation immediately withdrew every public honor previously awarded to Vivian Moretti. The crystal trophy from the charity gala was removed from display. Press statements were rewritten. Hospital officials issued a public apology to the anonymous donor whose identity had been concealed for years. They did not reveal Evelyn's name. Not yet. The surgeon insisted that decision belonged to her alone. Alessandro agreed immediately. Some truths deserved to be restored, not exploited. Vivian requested a private meeting. Alessandro accepted, not because he wanted revenge, because some conversations had to end face-to-face. She waited in an empty conference room, overlooking the hospital gardens. For the first time since he had known her, she looked exhausted. No designer elegance could hide it. "I suppose you know." "I do." She lowered her eyes. "I won't insult you by denying it." Silence settled between them. Finally she spoke. "I never expected Evelyn to disappear. I know. I never wanted Isabella harmed. I know. I told myself it was only recognition." She laughed bitterly. "Then I convinced myself that if everyone believed I had saved your family," she stopped, "perhaps someday I would become part of it." Alessandro remained quiet, not cold, simply honest. "You didn't steal my gratitude," he said gently. "You stole Evelyn's chance to be seen." Vivian closed her eyes. A tear slipped down her cheek. "I've spent years trying to become indispensable, and in doing so," she looked at him, "I became unforgettable for all the wrong reasons." When investigators entered the room a few minutes later, Vivian stood before they spoke. She picked up her handbag, straightened her jacket, then turned once more toward Alessandro. "I hope," her voice nearly broke, "you find her." He nodded. "So do I." She walked away without resistance. No shouting, no dramatic scene, only the quiet collapse of a life built upon a single terrible lie. That evening, the De Luca Foundation held an unexpected press conference. Journalists crowded the hall. Television cameras lined the back wall. Everyone expected Alessandro to defend the family's reputation. Instead, he stepped behind the podium, carrying only one sheet of paper. He looked directly into the cameras. "For many years," he began, "my family publicly thanked the wrong person for an act of extraordinary courage." The room became completely silent, he continued. "A woman gave part of herself to save my sister's life. She asked for nothing. No recognition, no reward, no public gratitude." He paused. "And because of our failure," his voice softened, "she received none." Every reporter waited for a name. Alessandro folded the paper. "I will not reveal her identity. That decision belongs to her. But I will spend the rest of my life making certain the truth is never hidden again." He stepped away from the podium before anyone could ask a question. Outside the building, old Thomas was waiting beside the car. "You did the right thing." Alessandro looked toward the evening sky. "It isn't enough." "No," Thomas agreed. "It isn't." "What if she never comes back?" The old butler smiled gently. "Then spend your life becoming the man she deserved. And if fate is kind—" He rested a hand on Alessandro's shoulder. "Perhaps she'll meet him one day." That night, Alessandro returned to the mansion alone. He walked into the bedroom. Her side of the closet was empty. Her favorite books were gone. The vase she always filled with fresh lilies stood dry for the first time. In 7 years he opened the bedside drawer. Inside lay a small notebook he had somehow never noticed. Tucked between its pages was a folded map. A tiny circle had been drawn around one remote mountain village. On the back, in Evelyn's familiar handwriting, were 4 simple words: "Where healing begins again." Alessandro traced the circle with his thumb. He smiled through tears. For the first time since she left, he no longer intended to chase her. He intended to earn the right to stand beside her, and somewhere beyond the mountains, completely unaware that the truth had finally come home. Evelyn stepped into a small rural clinic, believing she had closed the final chapter of her old life. 6 months passed. Winter surrendered quietly to spring. The headlines surrounding the hospital investigation disappeared. Court proceedings concluded. The former records administrator accepted responsibility for altering medical documents. Vivian Moretti pleaded guilty to fraud related to the false recognition records. She accepted the sentence without appeal. Before leaving the courtroom, she made one final request. She asked that a handwritten letter be delivered to Evelyn if their paths ever crossed again. No excuses, no demands for forgiveness, only an apology, the kind that arrived far too late. The De Luca Foundation changed in ways few people expected. Anonymous donor programs expanded across the country. New transplant scholarships were created for nurses entering trauma medicine. Every award ceremony now honored quiet acts of service instead of public prestige. The largest scholarship carried no family name. Its inscription simply read, "For those who save lives without asking to be seen." Only Alessandro knew why those words mattered so much. He never hired investigators to force Evelyn's location from confidential records. He never used influence to interrupt her mission. He remembered her final letter. "Come, because you've learned the difference." So he waited. He worked, He changed. Every Saturday he volunteered at free medical clinics funded by the foundation. At first, the doctors treated him like an honored guest. He corrected them immediately. "I'm here to help, not to be photographed, not to make speeches." He cleaned examination rooms, moved supply boxes, served meals to exhausted nurses. Sometimes patients never learned his name. For the first time in many years, that felt strangely liberating. Old Thomas noticed the difference long before anyone else. One afternoon he watched Alessandro carefully arranging fresh lilies inside the mansion, exactly the way Evelyn always had. "You remembered?" Alessandro smiled faintly. "No." He gently adjusted one flower. "I finally started paying attention." One evening the chief surgeon arrived carrying a weathered envelope. It came through an international aid organization. Alessandro accepted it carefully. There was no letter inside. Only a photograph. A small rural clinic stood beneath snow-capped mountains. Children laughed outside while volunteers unloaded medical supplies. Near the center of the picture, Evelyn knelt beside a little girl whose arm was wrapped in fresh bandages. She was smiling, not politely, not bravely, genuinely. On the back of the photograph were 8 handwritten words. "The children here laugh very easily." Nothing else. No address, no invitation. But the chief surgeon quietly placed another item on the table, a folded logistics report. The organization asked whether the foundation would consider funding a permanent medical center. Alessandro looked up. "They need equipment." The surgeon nodded. "They also need volunteers." 3 weeks later, a battered 4-wheel drive truck climbed a narrow mountain road. Dust rose behind its tires. The journey had taken nearly 2 days. When the truck finally stopped beside the small clinic, children immediately surrounded it, laughing with curiosity. Alessandro stepped out wearing faded jeans, hiking boots, and a plain blue work shirt. No bodyguards, no expensive watch, no tailored suit, only a backpack filled with medical supplies. A young volunteer approached. "You must be from the foundation." "I am. We've been expecting the shipment. I'm here to stay for a while." She smiled. "We're always grateful for extra hands." He looked toward the clinic, his heartbeat quietly accelerated. Then, the door opened. Evelyn stepped outside, carrying a sleeping toddler in her arms. She stopped walking for several seconds. Neither of them moved. The wind carried the scent of pine trees across the valley. Children continued laughing nearby. Somewhere a church bell rang. Everything else disappeared. Evelyn gently handed the child to another nurse. She walked toward him slowly. When they finally stood face to face, neither reached for the other. "You found us." Her voice was calm. "I did." She searched his face. "I asked you not to come because you felt guilty." "I know, and yet, I didn't come because of guilt." A quiet silence settled between them. He opened his backpack, not to reveal flowers, not jewelry, not expensive gifts. He removed a pair of worn work gloves. "I heard the new clinic still needs a roof." She looked at the gloves, then back at him. "I've never built one before." He smiled softly. "But I'd like to learn." For the first time in months, she smiled too, small, careful, real. The weeks that followed were nothing like their old life. They woke before sunrise, they carried lumber together, prepared meals for volunteers, visited families living in isolated mountain villages. Sometimes they spoke for hours, sometimes they worked quietly side by side. The silence no longer felt like distance, it felt like peace. One rainy afternoon, they repaired broken shelves inside the clinic pharmacy. Alessandro accidentally hammered his thumb. Evelyn laughed, a bright, unrestrained laugh he had never heard during their marriage. He stared at her. "What?" "I've missed that sound." She looked away shyly. "I forgot I still laughed like that." "No," he answered gently. "I just forgot how to give you reasons." Weeks became months. Trust returned slowly, not through dramatic declarations, through ordinary mornings. Shared coffee. Long conversations after exhausting days. Apologies repeated through consistent choices instead of beautiful words. One evening they sat outside the clinic watching the sunset color the mountains gold. Alessandro reached into his pocket. The silver bracelet rested in his hand. "I carried this every day." She looked at it quietly. "So did I." She reached into the pocket of her jacket. The matching bracelet appeared. Time had worn both pieces smooth. He looked at her. "I remembered." She waited. "I remembered the little girl crying in the hospital. I remembered the young nurse who gave Isabella her bracelet because she was frightened." His voice trembled. "I remembered meeting a woman who believed kindness should never expect applause." A tear slipped gently down Evelyn's cheek. "You remembered." "I should have remembered much sooner." He lowered his eyes. "I can't give you back the 7 years I failed to truly see you." No, she answered honestly. You can't. Another quiet moment passed, but she stepped closer. We still have tomorrow. He looked up. Hope returned so softly that it almost hurt. He held out the bracelet. I don't deserve another chance. You don't. She smiled through tears. Neither do I. She gently took the bracelet from his hand. Instead of fastening it around only one wrist, she linked both bracelets together. Then wrapped the joined bracelets loosely around both of their hands, not as chains, not as promises they were forced to keep, as a reminder that love could only survive when two people chose it freely. Months later, the new medical center officially opened. Children from nearby villages lined the entrance holding wildflowers gathered from the mountains. A small wooden sign hung above the front door. There was no mention of the De Luca family, no donor recognition wall. Only a single sentence carved into the cedar by local craftsmen. Healing begins where love asks for nothing in return. As the ceremony ended, Isabella embraced Evelyn with tears in her eyes. I've thanked the wrong person for 7 years. Evelyn gently touched her face. You thanked the person you believed had saved you. I'm thanking the right one now. They hugged tightly. Nearby, old Thomas quietly wiped away a tear. The chief surgeon smiled with quiet relief. No applause echoed across the mountains. No cameras flashed. No speeches competed for attention. Only the sounds of children laughing, wind moving through the trees, and two people walking home together. Not because one owed the other a debt, but because, at last, they had learned that the strongest love was never built on obligation. It was built on seeing one another completely and choosing each other again.